But right now at 4 o'clock, we've got a big development in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today's Show co-host Savannah Guthrie. Our NBC5 investigative team has been following this case very closely, and Chuck Gowdy joins us now in studio with the video that was released today by the FBI.
That same afternoon, the FBI released what might still be the single most important video tied to this entire case. Not long after, a man was pulled over on a quiet stretch of road roughly 60 miles south of Tucson. His wife was driving. Deputies had already been tracking the vehicle, and within minutes, he stopped being just a passenger. He was in the back of a patrol car, reciting his name, his date of birth, and his social security number to officers. A few hours later, federal agents were standing inside his house with a warrant in hand. His phone was seized. His front door and garage door were left broken from the search. And in the middle of all that chaos, his own mother-in-law said something on live television that no family should ever have to say. She told reporters investigators had shown her a photo of the masked figure captured on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera, and that the eyes looked familiar to her. This wasn't some internet theory pieced together from grainy screenshots. It wasn't an anonymous account making wild comparisons online. This came directly from the man himself, standing outside his own home after agents had already gone through it. He repeated the same story to reporters, on camera, that very night. His name was Carlos Palazuelos. For a short stretch in February, his name was everywhere. Then, almost overnight, it disappeared. New names, new theories took over the conversation. Tomaso, Dominic Evans, Mexico, the reservation. Every fresh angle pulled attention somewhere else. But Carlos was left in a strange limbo. He was never charged. He was never officially named a suspect. And based on everything publicly available, he never got the one thing he asked for from the very beginning. A clear statement saying he had nothing to do with it. That same night, the FBI director told the public investigators were looking at more than one person. His exact phrase was, multiple persons of interest. Carlos Palazuelos appears to have been one name among several that investigators were trying to sort through. And yet, 4 months later, most people following this case barely remember him. Before we go further, hit subscribe, because this channel is built around the details everyone else skips past. Every quote and fact in this video comes from named reporting, including Fox News, Newsweek, NBC News, ABC 15, and other public sources. Nothing here is stated as fact, unless it has already been reported publicly. This is Brian Records. For anyone just discovering this case, here's the background. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, the mother of Today's Show, co-host Savannah Guthrie. On Saturday night, January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner at her daughter Annie's home in Tucson. Her son-in-law, Tomaso Chion, drove her home around 9:45 p.m. She walked inside, the garage door closed behind her, and by the next morning, she was gone. She missed church. Her family reported her missing that Sunday, February 1st. From that moment forward, this became one of the most disturbing person cases in recent memory. There was blood on the porch, later confirmed to be Nancy's. Her doorbell camera had been physically unplugged. The device still showed movement at the home afterward, but because Nancy didn't have an active cloud subscription, investigators initially couldn't pull the footage. For a while, it looked like the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case had simply vanished. Then came the ransom letters. At least 3 media outlets received letters claiming responsibility, complete with payment demands and deadlines. One deadline passed on a Thursday. Another passed the following Monday. No one could confirm whether any of the letters were genuine. Then, a man in California was arrested for sending a separate, fake ransom note, making an already tangled investigation even harder to untangle. By the second week, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had logged nearly 18,000 tips. More than 4,000 of those came in during a single 24-hour stretch right after the footage was released. Hundreds of detectives and agents were working the case around the clock. Nancy's pacemaker and her blood pressure medication were still sitting inside her home. And for more than a week, the blood on the porch remained the only solid physical evidence the public knew about. Then, on Tuesday, February 10th, everything shifted. FBI Director Kash Patel released recovered video and still images pulled from Nancy's doorbell camera. Investigators had worked with the camera company to retrieve residual data straight from their back-end servers. What came back showed a masked figure approaching the front door, wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, and appearing to have a holstered handgun.
This is where the FBI is now weighing in after a day of just confusion over the legitimacy of the alleged kidnapping notes in the Nancy Guthrie case. Now, before I even read you their statement from earlier, let me just catch you up to speed on how we got here last night. We told you about a Reuters report citing an FBI official who said that all three communications linked to the case.
The figure kept its head tilted downward while passing beneath the archway, almost as if it already knew exactly where the camera sat. At one point, the person reached down, grabbed plants right out of Nancy's own yard, and held them up to block the lens. For investigators, this was finally the break they'd been waiting for. Savannah Guthrie shared the images not long after, saying someone out there had to recognize this person, and that the family still believed Nancy was alive. She asked whoever was responsible to bring her mother home. That same night, Director Patel appeared on Hannity and made a comment that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. He said investigators weren't focused on just one person. Law enforcement, he said, was looking into multiple persons of interest. That detail matters because what happened later that night in Rio Rico wasn't random. Carlos Palazuelos wasn't pulled into this because somebody spotted a blurry photo online. He was, by all appearances, one lead among several that investigators were actively checking at the very same time. Later that Tuesday night, as the doorbell images spread across the country, Pima County deputies stopped a gray SUV near Rio Rico, Arizona, a small community roughly 60 miles south of Tucson, close to the Mexican border. Carlos's wife was behind the wheel. Carlos sat in the passenger seat. Within the hour, the sheriff's department released a short statement saying a subject had been detained in connection with the Nancy Guthrie investigation. One sentence, and the entire night turned into a media storm. Reporters from national outlets raced toward Rio Rico. Just hours earlier, the public had been studying a masked figure holding plants up to a doorbell camera. Now there was a real name, a real family, a real house, and a real man caught in the center of it all. That night, the FBI's evidence response team and Pima County deputies obtained a court-authorized search warrant for a home in Rio Rico. Reporters described a heavy law enforcement presence outside. Agents forced entry through the front door and the garage door. A family that hadn't been charged with anything watched federal agents tear through their home in the middle of the night. Inside that home was Josefina, Carlos's mother-in-law. Before Carlos had even been released, she was already talking to reporters on live television. She gave his full name and said flatly that he had nothing to do with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. She described him as a good man with no criminal record and no history of violence. She said investigators had shown her the doorbell footage and asked whether the clothing matched anything Carlos owned. According to her, it didn't. But then she said something else, something that would follow Carlos long after that night. She said investigators had shown her an image from the footage and pointed to the eyes. According to Carlos, that single detail was what led to his detention. By around 1 a.m., the search was over. Investigators left the property. Carlos walked away without charges. But what happened after his release is where this stops being about procedure and starts being about what one night can do to an ordinary person's life. Carlos returned to a house with a broken front door and a broken garage door. Reporters were already waiting outside. He gave multiple interviews in the early morning hours, standing outside the same home agents had just torn apart. Speaking to Fox 10 Phoenix, he explained what he understood about why he'd been dragged into this. Investigators, he said, had shown his mother-in-law a photo of someone wearing a mask, and she supposedly thought the eyes resembled his. Sit with that for a second. From Carlos's perspective, he was detained because of a partial glimpse of someone's eyes through a mask in low light on a doorbell camera. He said officers asked him basic identifying questions: his first name, last name, date of birth, social security number. When reporters asked if he had ever been to Nancy Guthrie's home, his answer wasn't dramatic at all. He said it was possible, but he honestly didn't know. His explanation was simple. He worked as a delivery driver, running routes all across Tucson. It was entirely possible he'd once dropped a package at Nancy's home the same way he'd dropped packages at thousands of other homes. When asked if he'd ever heard of Nancy Guthrie before that night, he said no. Defense attorney Ben Taylor later broke down the legal side of a stop like this. Police can stop someone if they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause, and that part may well have been lawful. But Taylor also pointed out that people still have Fourth Amendment rights in moments like these. They can refuse a vehicle search. They can ask for a lawyer before answering anything. His advice was blunt: say you're innocent, ask for an attorney, and stop talking. Carlos did the opposite. He answered every question. He told investigators where he'd been, what his work schedule looked like, everything he knew. He cooperated because he believed it was the fastest way to prove he had nothing to hide. Looking back, Taylor's words feel like a quiet warning. A person can be completely innocent and still end up frightened, talkative, detained, and overwhelmed, simply because they don't know what they're allowed to say no to. Carlos also described what happened to his vehicle. Officers placed him in a patrol car while they searched his car. Eventually, it was returned to him. Publicly, there was no report of drugs, weapons, or anything tying that vehicle to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. In a separate interview, Carlos described the whole experience in plain terms. He said it felt like being kidnapped because no one explained anything to him. He said he was held against his will and that his rights weren't read to him for hours. Then, standing outside his damaged home, he said the line that defined that entire night. He hoped investigators found the real suspect because it wasn't him. He said they needed to do their job and clear his name. This is the part of the story that nearly disappeared from public conversation altogether. Carlos Palazuelos didn't just fade away once the news cycle moved on. He kept fighting to clear his name because no one else seemed to be doing it for him. About a week later, he sat down with ABC 15 reporter Ford Hatchett alongside his attorney, Jesse Scholter. In that interview, Carlos described what his life had become since his name got tied to the case. He said people were photographing him and his family. He said people were following them. He described doing DoorDash deliveries with his wife and noticing a red truck trailing them, then seeing that same truck again the next morning. For a working family, that kind of attention isn't abstract, it's constant. Carlos still had to go out and make deliveries. His wife, who had simply been driving the SUV that night, was now caught in the public spotlight too. Their kids were living in a house that had been searched and damaged. Their father's name had been connected on national television to a missing 84-year-old woman, and no public statement had ever cleared him. His attorney made one simple request of Pima County Sheriff Chris Nasnos: publicly state that Carlos Palazuelos had nothing to do with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. As far as the public record shows, that statement never came. Carlos wasn't charged. He wasn't officially named a suspect in any press release. But he also wasn't publicly cleared, not in writing, not on camera, not in any formal way. He was left in the worst possible spot, not accused in court, but never cleared either. There's one more detail from that period that's caused a lot of confusion. Around the same general time, two separate SUVs got tangled up in this investigation in two completely different ways. One was the gray SUV Carlos and his wife were driving when deputies stopped them near Rio Rico. The other was a blue SUV investigators later pulled out of Nancy Guthrie's own garage and towed for examination. Two vehicles, two locations, two entirely separate threats. But online, those details have often gotten blended together, as if one SUV somehow explains the other. It doesn't. Mixing them up only makes an already confusing timeline harder to follow. That's exactly why timelines matter in a case like this. When a story moves fast, with multiple searches, multiple vehicles, multiple names, and multiple detentions, small details start to warp. Warped details turn into theories, and theories built on confused facts rarely hold up under any real scrutiny. So let's go back to the eyes. That detail deserves more than a passing mention. It deserves real scrutiny. Facial identification experts have warned for years that recognizing someone from a tiny sliver of visible face is extremely unreliable, especially when that person is masked, moving, and captured on a consumer-grade camera in low light. Eyes can look completely different depending on expression, angle, lighting, and image quality. That doesn't prove Carlos was wrongly detained. It simply means the identification behind it was fragile from the start. Eyewitness identification is already one of the weakest forms of evidence out there, especially under stress. Add a ski mask, poor lighting, motion blur, and the emotional weight of being shown an image tied to your own son-in-law, and the reliability drops even further. There's a psychological angle here too. When someone is shown an image and asked whether it resembles a person they know, the question itself can plant a connection. A person may start noticing similarities they wouldn't have otherwise. That doesn't mean Josefina lied. It doesn't mean she acted with any bad intent. It means the entire situation was loaded from the very first moment. And to be fair, investigators had to follow up. If a family member looks at an image and says the eyes resemble someone close to her, law enforcement can't just ignore that in an active investigation involving a missing 84-year-old woman. The stop, the search, the questioning, all of it was part of chasing a lead. But what happened after that lead apparently went nowhere. That's the real issue. Once Carlos was released, once no public evidence tied him to the disappearance, and once his attorney formally asked for his name to be cleared, the silence became a problem all its own. Now here's where this case gets more complicated. Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic psychologist who's analyzed the case publicly, discussed the type of person investigators should be looking at. He said that when someone is killed or abducted, the person responsible is often not a complete stranger. It can be someone with a passing connection. Someone who worked at the home, someone seen around a nearby store, someone with basic familiarity with the property. He also said the circle of people who might know something is usually much smaller than the public assumes. Investigators, he suggested, should be looking at anyone connected to the home, the property, the finances, or the services coming and going from the house. A delivery driver could easily fit that broad category. That doesn't mean Carlos is guilty. It doesn't mean he should be accused of anything. It means his job placed him in a category investigators would naturally want to examine. Someone who might have passed through Nancy's neighborhood, maybe even her property, without either of them ever really registering it. A delivery route creates its own strange kind of familiarity. Drivers learn which homes have gates, dogs, cameras, steep driveways, or people who actually answer the door. Over time, they build a working knowledge of a neighborhood without ever having a personal relationship with anyone living there. That's the exact kind of passing familiarity experts keep pointing to. Not friendship, not a known relationship, just repeated exposure. To be clear, This is not an accusation against Carlos Palazuelos. He has not been charged with anything. There is no public evidence proving he was involved. The point is simply that he got pulled into this investigation because he fit a loose investigative category and because someone believed the eyes in the footage looked like his. So why did the lead go quiet? There's no public record showing Pima County gave any detailed follow-up about Carlos after his release. No update on the phone seized from his home. No public explanation of whether anything was ever found. From the outside, it looks like the trail simply went cold. The broader case, though, kept moving. 4 days later, on February 14th, another person was detained near Nancy's own neighborhood, closer to the Catalina foothills area rather than Rio Rico. That person was also questioned and released, but got far less public attention. In most of the reporting, that individual wasn't even widely identified by name. One man became a national headline, another became a footnote. That gap says a lot about how chaotic this investigation looked from the outside. As time passed, the tips slowed down. The flood of calls that once overwhelmed the sheriff's department began to dry up. The Guthrie family later announced a $1 million reward to shake loose new information. Investigators reportedly returned to Nancy's home after that reward was announced, suggesting the case was still very much alive, but the public learned almost nothing new. Meanwhile, the conversation moved on to other things. People fixated on Tommaso Cian's silence. Others zeroed in on Dominic Evans and his long history playing in a band with Tommaso. Theories spread about Mexico, the border, gait analysis, DNA, every angle imaginable. Carlos Palazuelos was mostly left behind, not charged, not cleared, just forgotten. That should bother people. A private citizen with no criminal history, who cooperated, answered every question, allowed the searches, and was released without charges, should not be left hanging in permanent uncertainty. He asked for a public statement through his attorney. As far as the public record shows, he never got one. To be fair, law enforcement did have a legitimate reason to chase that lead. A family member said the eyes in the image looked familiar. In a missing person case involving an elderly woman, ignoring that would have been reckless. But fairness cuts in both directions. Carlos Palazuelos has never been publicly shown to have any real connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance beyond a partial resemblance in a masked image and the possibility that his delivery work may have taken him through her neighborhood at some point. He cooperated. He answered questions. He was released. No charges followed. Both things can be true at once. Investigators may have been justified in checking that lead, and the failure to publicly clear a man after that lead went nowhere may still be deeply unfair. That gap right there is what this story is really about. It's the space between reasonable police work and a private citizen left exposed after the cameras move on to the next thing. Think about the other major names tied to this case. Tommaso Cian had public statements confirming the family was cleared. Annie and Savannah had national media attention and public support behind them. Dominic Evans had his side of the story told across major outlets. Carlos Palazuelos got none of that. He got a damaged home, a family being followed, and one public quote asking investigators to find the real suspect so his name could finally be cleared. That imbalance deserves attention. It raises a bigger question about who gets public protection in a high-profile investigation and who's left to deal with the fallout completely alone. When some people are formally cleared and others are just quietly released, the public fills that silence with assumptions, and assumptions can wreck lives. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. More than 4 months after that January night, no one has been charged. The recovered doorbell footage remains one of the clearest pieces of evidence the public has ever seen. Somewhere in the investigative record, there's still the open question of Carlos's seized phone and no public explanation of what, if anything, came from it. Maybe nothing was found. Maybe the silence means exactly that. The lead went nowhere. And if that's true, it's even more reason Carlos deserved the statement he asked for. Because until someone says it clearly, this story stays unresolved. The eyes that looked familiar. The mother-in-law who named him on live television. The man's standing outside his damaged house at 3 in the morning, asking reporters to help clear his name. All of it frozen in public memory, with no ending in sight. And there's one possibility that deserves to be said plainly. What if Carlos Palazuelos is exactly who he says he is? A delivery driver who got unlucky. A man whose eyes happen to resemble a masked stranger's in a grainy image. Someone who cooperated fully and then spent months dealing with suspicion and harassment for something he never did. If that's the truth, and no public evidence has shown otherwise, then Pima County's silence isn't just a missing update. It becomes a small, ongoing injustice that no one in authority has bothered to correct. 4 months have passed, and maybe the hardest part isn't admitting a lead failed. Maybe the hardest part is saying it out loud after the whole country watched the search happen live. Tell me what you think in the comments. Should Pima County have publicly cleared Carlos Palazuelos months ago? And does Dr. Brucato's profile, someone with a passing connection to Nancy, not necessarily a total stranger, point to a category investigators still need to look at more closely? This is Brian Records. I'll see you in the next one.